Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where we find you in this great country of ours. Thank you for joining us for what I hope will be an informative, entertaining, enjoyable conversation about a very important topic, critical race theory. Now, I want to acknowledge off the top that this is a discussion that people are often uncomfortable with. And when I say uncomfortable, I mean, people sort of want to stay in their echo chambers on a conversation about an issue this sensitive, on an issue this important. We are very happy to say that we have brought together a very interesting group of people who want to get out of echo chambers and actually share their point of view, who are willing to exchange ideas with people who might disagree with them or come from a different perspective, a different set of experiences, perhaps even a different worldview. And I think that's really exciting. So I'm really happy to welcome you to this conversation hosted by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It's a feature of a project called Speak for Ourselves. I'm Jamil Giovanni, and I am, among other things, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where I focus on issues related to diversity and empowerment. Before I get started in maybe introducing the idea of critical race theory, so we're all on the same page with a working definition of what exactly we're talking about, I'd like to first welcome our panelists. It's an all-star group that I'm really excited to hear from. We have joining us Samuel Say, who is a writer, blogger, and the owner of slowtowrite.com. We're also joined by Noah Jarvis, who is a university student at York University. He's also a reporter at True North, an emerging journalist in the country. We're joined by Dave Meslin, who's an author of a book called Tear Down, Rebuilding Democracy from the Ground Up. He's also a veteran community organizer in the Toronto area. Another community organizer, Chris Lockhart, is a graduate of Concordia University, a community leader who serves many different organizations and causes, very focused on poverty and related issues. We're joined by Rupa Subramanya, who many of you will know from her very popular podcast on True North. She's also a columnist and writer for a number of publications, including the National Post. And Sonia Orlu, who is a PhD student in political science at Simon Fraser University. So very happy to welcome each of our panelists. And before I get to asking them questions, and again, we're very grateful for the questions that have already been submitted by the audience. So thank you for that. I first want to establish some of the terms of conversation. And I'd like to begin with a little bit of the journey for how we got to this event here on October 5th. Some of you may have heard about this event through a column I wrote for the Toronto Sun a few weeks ago, where I put out an open challenge for someone to come and have a conversation and defend critical race theory, explain why it's a good thing, because again, we often get caught up in our echo chambers, and I was seeing a lot of people in the media I consume be very critical of CRT, and so we wanted to bring together people who might have a different point of view. That is, to be honest with you, a lot harder to do than it is to say. And unfortunately, it took a lot of effort to try to put together a conversation that would be nuanced and inclusive of different points of view. So the journey of getting here, I think, has affirmed a lot of the frustrations that people feel today in our country about how hard it is to have healthy, dynamic conversations about things that are important. And our hope in putting this event together is that we will be able to provide an example of how to do that well in a spirit of respect and debate and discourse with one another. So part of doing that is making sure that we're operating with some sort of shared definition of what we're talking about. And with critical race theory in particular, that can be difficult because people often like to point to ivory tower ideologies and say, well, you're not educated enough to be able to talk about this, or you're not from the right racial or ethnic community to talk about this, that somehow our identity or our profession or our life experience should limit what we can say and do. I obviously disagree with that, and I think our panelists do as well, although they do come from different points of view. So I'm going to establish some definitions here that can help guide our conversation in appreciation of the fact that people will have different points of view, and you may hear contesting definitions or perspectives from the panelists throughout our conversation today. So the first definition I want to establish of what is critical race theory. When we say CRT, what are we talking about? I want to start with one of the theory's architects who teaches at Columbia University's law school, Kimberly Crenshaw. She's widely regarded as one of the biggest influences in critical race theory, both in academia and in how it has expanded outside of the halls of academia to influence public policy and corporate boardrooms and things of that nature. When asked about CRT by the New York Times, this is how Kimberly Crenshaw defined her theory. It is a way of seeing, attending to, accounting for, tracing, and analyzing the ways that race is produced and the ways that racial inequality is facilitated and the ways that our history has created these inequalities that now can be almost effortlessly reproduced unless we attend to the existence of these inequalities. There's a lot there, and part of what we're going to do today is unpack that. So I won't spend too much time on these. I just want to establish some shared definitions for the purpose of our conversation today. A second part of this that I want to share is a view by another one of critical race theory's primary architects, this one being a New York University law professor, Derek Bell, who described his point of view, his conclusion about critical race theory as racism is an integral, permanent, and indestructible component of this society. He then went on to say that Black people will never gain full equality in this country. He's referring to the United States, but of course, as critical race theory has expanded north of the border, this perspective has also impacted us significantly in Canada as well. And what's interesting about this is I think that this definition of CRT offered by Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell is actually shared by opponents of CRT. They actually agree, I think, on what CRT is. One of the most well-known opponents of critical race theory is a gentleman by the name of Christopher Rufo, who is based at the Manhattan Institute in New York City. Here's how he defined it, which is very much in line with what Crenshaw and Bell had to say. Quote, critical race theory is an academic discipline that holds that the United States is a nation founded on white supremacy and oppression, and that these forces are still at the root of our society. So those are three perspectives on what critical race theory means. And I think it's important that we kind of go into this conversation with some sense of what we're referring to when we say CRT. So let's get started, because I think you've heard enough from me. I really want to spend some time with our esteemed panelists today. We're going to start with Samuel Say from slowtowrite.com. And Samuel, I'd like for you to start with giving us your sense of how prevalent is critical race theory in Canada today? What do you see as the influence of the ideology?
Yeah, it shocks a lot of Canadians when I say this, but critical race theory is either just as popular here in Canada as it is in the United States, or perhaps even more popular because it's not received anywhere near the kind of challenge it's received from parents or politicians in Canada as it has in the U.S. But just to give you a list of evidence to explain why this is very prevalent in the nation, is this. Canada, there was a poll that was, I'm forgetting exactly which newspaper had this study, but they had a poll that asked Canadians if they believe that Canada is systemically racist. The poll showed that 54% of Canadians believe that it is. That number is identical to a similar poll in the U.S. 54%. Now, the average person would generally tell you that Canada doesn't have anywhere near the kind of racist history, or at least as severe, as wide as it was in America. And yet, because of critical race theory, over half of the population in Canada believes that America, or I should say Canada, is as racist as America, at least historically and now. We've also had politicians suggesting that critical race theory should be taught in schools. So you had Jenica Atwin, a Liberal MP, who said that we need Canadian kids to study engineering, science, sustainable agriculture, and critical race theory. And frankly, the schools have followed suit. I've mentioned, not to promote my blog, but I have an article on my blog, Slow to Write, that addresses this issue that across all of Ontario and Canada, you have a lot of school boards teaching critical race theory as part of the curriculum. I've had part of my job. I work for PAIF, Parents as First Educators in Ontario, and I've had a lot of educators, parents sending me documents that shows that critical race theory is an integral part of the school curriculums. So, for example, a lot of kids kindergarten are being read The Anti-Racist Baby by Ibram Kendi from the book. He wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. You also have teenagers. You also have young children also learning white fragility from Robin DiAngelo. By the way, a book that says that a positive, this is word for word, a positive white identity is an impossible goal. This is what is being read to students in Peel and across Ontario. You also had in Hamilton, the city of Hamilton, you had when they were rolling their vaccine, they mentioned that they wanted to factor in racial equity, which would give non-white people access to the vaccine before white people. You also have, of course, teachers like Chanel Fall, who's right now being investigated over saying on social media that she is against critical race theory. You also had, of course, Mike Ramsey, who I believe is the school board trustee at Waterloo, who was suspended because he is not woke, including because he rejects critical race theory. And of course, the most radical critical race theory bill in all of in the entire world. And I say that I study this. This is what I'm passionate about. There hasn't been a single bill that is more radical than Bill 667 originally, and now Bill 16, which is being passed by the NDP, which would basically suggest that all school boards across Ontario should teach critical race theory as a integral part of the curriculum, which is already being said. But the problem with this is that it would fine. I mean, it's vague in the language, but in this bill, it would fine students, parents, and perhaps teachers who would, quote disrupt teachings on anti-racism $200 if they're not buying critical race theory in the schools. It would also force teachers to be, according to their wording, to be fully trained and implement critical race theory or anti-racism in the schools before they would be certified or gain or keep the certification. So critical race theory is absolutely everywhere. But I'll also give a personal example. I was asked to come teach at a Christian school in Alberta last year, and they asked me to just simply talk about racism. Now, the audience here will not be surprised if they're watching the video that I'm a Black man. And yet, when I was asked to come speak at the school on racism, afterward, when I had mentioned that critical race theory is an unhelpful idea for Canada and for Christians, they actually wrote a statement a few weeks later to condemn me for denigrating the students, which I didn't, but I simply said that Canada is not systemically racist. And they were, again, as a so-called Christian school, they were denouncing me for this. Critical race theory is absolutely prevalent in our nation.
Thank you, Samuel. Appreciate your perspective on that. And I do want to come back to Bill 16 in Ontario, the formerly known as Bill 67, later on. But I appreciate you introducing it because I think there's a lot for us to talk about there in terms of the practical implication of the conversation we're having right now. This is not just a conversation about theory. This is a conversation that is affecting policy on the day-to-day right now. All right, next up, I want to go to you, Noah, because Noah, you're on a university campus right now. You're currently a student. You're also a journalist. I'm curious to know why you do not embrace critical race theory. You know, you're very vocal about your discomfort with this ideology, and I'd love to hear why.
Well, I don't think that critical race theory is an accurate way of viewing the world. I think it misses the marks on its proposed solutions, and I also believe that it creates, more racial division in the country, just in society in general, than, we would have without it. Critical race theory, from what I've read of critical race theorists' work, the type of arguments that critical race theorists or people who make, adjacent arguments make, they like to point to prove that Canada, United States is a systemically racist society. They point to certain disparities, whether that be in income, whether that be in educational outcomes, and they say this is proof of the system, this country working against Black people, so that they are not able to reach and have the same life outcomes that white people are granted, which is simply not the case. If when you look on a case by case basis of disparities between Blacks and whites on, say, income, you can attribute the disparity not to discrimination, but to the actual reasons for why people might make more than other people. For example, the quality of one's education that someone receives, and just their educational history, how much time they studied while they were in school. For example, a 2011 study showed that Black students on average study a lot less than white students, and white students study a lot less than Asian students, which is the reason why white students perform better than Black students in school and Asian students perform better than white students at school. It is not a matter of systemic racism. It is a matter of actions that influence an individual's actions that influence their educational outcomes. And I just pointed out the fact that Asian students generally perform better than white students in education. They usually make more money. That is not indicative of a system that is racist. It's not a system indicative of a system that is working against racial minorities. Canada, in specific, has had a long history of discriminating against not just Black people, but Indigenous people, against specifically Asian Canadians. In the Asian Canadians were sent to internment camps during the Second World War because of fears that they would be spying on the Canadian public and feeding information back to the Japanese, and they were sent to internment camps and forced labor camps. And despite that fact, despite that historical injustice and other historical injustice that have been perpetrated against Asian Americans or Asian Canadians and Asian Americans perform better than whites, and that is because Asian Canadians do a better job at meeting the prerequisites to success that it takes to achieve success in various domains. Instead, critical race theory views these racial disparities as proof that there has been racial discrimination, which is simply not the case. And I believe that this sort of view of looking at race in this way, prioritizing race over one person's individual characteristics and traits. So when you see someone for the first time, you judge them based on their quote unquote whiteness or their quote unquote Blackness instead of what they may have to offer as a human being, or maybe a teacher, or maybe an engineer. And this sort of prioritization of racial thinking, I believe, creates the potential for a sort of backlash. If we want white people to view the world is as a place where you have to show deference to Black people, almost as treat them as if they're not inferior, but that they need extra aids or extra protection compared to white people, then you might create the perspective, or you will create the perspective, that Black people are inherently inferior because Black people sort of need these extra measures to succeed in society. And I believe that with the rise of sort of hate crimes and the sort of white supremacist backlash that you might see in a very small contingent of people, may I clarify, but I believe that the rise of this lately has been because of the excessive push of critical race theorists to sort of prioritize the how important race is to our everyday lives. Instead of saying race is important to our everyday lives, thus we need to show deference to Black people, some people might come to the conclusion that race is so important that we need to sort of marginalize and engage in eugenics. It's just sort of the rationalization for a lot of white progressives. I just want to conclude with the fact that progressivism has been the sort of ideology. The progressives have been the sort of people who have historically been focused on race. In the early 20th century, this focus on race was, directed towards things like eugenics and the idea that blacks were inherently inferior, and they did this by pointing to IQ tests in the military, for example. Instead, progressives have morphed that view from, race is still important, but instead of using it to marginalize, we need to use it to oppress. And I believe those forces can come back to, using viewing blacks as a group to protect, from back to the old view that blacks are a group that need to be, controlled.
Very interesting, Noah. Thank you. So we're going to keep the conversation going because I'm sure I want to make sure we have time to get to audience questions. Please do submit them. Next up, I welcome Dave Meslin. Now, Dave actually responded to the challenge I put out in the Toronto Sun for someone to defend critical race theory. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Dave, he is a veteran community organizer, a very well-respected progressive voice in Toronto, someone whose work I've seen in the Toronto Star and other places for well over a decade now. So not only was it cool to get someone to respond to us and say, hey, I do want to come on and have this conversation, but also someone of his caliber. So Dave, very happy to welcome you. And I think maybe the question I'll just sort of pose to you is, why did you feel like you wanted to respond to the challenge in the Toronto Sun? Why did you want to be part of this conversation? What do you think the merits of CRT are?
Sure. Thanks, Jamil. It's great to see you. You and I have been crossing paths for quite some time now. Why did I respond? Well, you mentioned the phrase echo chamber a few minutes ago, right? And we do see a lot of echo chambers in politics these days. So people on the right or the left or whatever community you identify with, you watch, certain talk show hosts, or you follow certain social media channels, and we're kind of all just preaching to the choir, to our own choirs. So I like the way you framed it. You're like, let's have a discussion about this. But there was also a tone in your challenge. Well, you called it a challenge. There was almost a suggestion that like no one out there would have the courage to defend this, radical idea, when really it's, I believe it's a very straightforward, very mainstream, not radical idea at all. And so I didn't want there to be, I didn't want to have you or anyone else have the opportunity to say no one accepted this challenge. Of course, I can defend CRT effortlessly. Let me just quickly go through some of my story, which helps explain why I would have an opinion on this at all, and why my opinion is what it is. I was raised in the 1970s, 1980s, where discussions around racism were very different than they are now. We were essentially taught that we were in a post-racist world, and that the best thing we could do is just to kind of ignore color, that we should be colorblind. There used to be racism, we're done with that. Don't judge anyone based on how they look. And that sounded very nice. I liked it. I liked the way it sounded. I liked living in a post-racist world. But certain things that I saw around this, I grew up in a neighborhood in North York that was almost exclusively white. If someone was black walking in the neighborhood, they were probably working for someone, cleaning a window, cleaning a house, taking care of someone's children. But when I got on the TTC bus, the 95 York Mills bus heading towards the subway, it was full of black people. And I was like, wait, where are they coming from? What neighborhood is that? And I allegedly was living in this post-racist world, long after any type of segregation existed, obviously on paper. Yet I was getting strong visual cues that there were white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. And I also noticed that the white neighborhoods had single family homes and the black neighborhoods had towers. And I was like, okay, this is not the same story I've been told. And then of course I've been exposed to lots of data over time, some of which was just mentioned about the uneven or non-proportionate outcomes we have in the prison system, for example, where the black population greatly outnumbers per capita the white population in our prison system. Now, in the 1990s and 2000s, the conversation started to shift, but really only in, at least as I could see it, academic circles and activist circles. And we had anti-oppression workshops, and we were hear a lot about white privilege and checking your privilege. And I was fascinated by that. I found myself to be very defensive at first. I felt like it was a bit of an attack on me. Like, wait a minute, anti-oppression? Are you saying that I'm oppressing people? I'm an oppressor? I didn't like that at first. But the more I learned about it, and the more I tried to learn about it, I actually found it to be a very helpful framing to help me understand this world that had been so confusing to me as a child. And Jamil, you were a part of that process, you know, in your TED Talk and some of the stuff you talked about 10, 15 years ago, being afraid of police in high school because your experience as a Black person was different than a white person. And just, I started to hear people like you and others talk about how lived experience changes how you interact with the world. And having a Black body might mean that you get treated differently than having a white body. And I wanted to learn what that meant, because I have a very white body, and on all the different, I've got them all. And I wanted to learn about that more. At this point, as you all know, this way of thinking has become incredibly mainstream. It's not considered controversial at all. And I guess one thing I've been trying to figure out is, where is the backlash coming from? Why are people so angry being asleep and being ignorant? And I'm very happy to be woke. And one of the main pushes against wokeness and against CRT and against all this seems to be coming from a kind of conservative right, often evangelical segments of the population that doesn't like all the stuff that's happened in the last 20 years. Same-sex marriage, trans rights, abortion. And I really believe in separation of church and state. I'm very proud of all the changes we've gone through as a society. And I'm very proud to stand up and defend those changes. And I don't want to see us lose ground on any of those things. And I'll just quickly wrap up by saying, you mentioned a few of the different definitions early on. I didn't agree with all of them, but the one from Crenshaw said, we should learn about how history has created inequalities and try and benefit from that discussion. Honestly, Jamil, I can't understand why anyone wouldn't want to do that, wouldn't see value in that, and I don't understand where the backlash is coming from.
Thank you very much, Dave. I think a lot of really good stuff there for us to dig into more as the conversation continues. So I will come back to some of Dave's points and give others a chance to weigh in on them as well. But I want to give everyone a chance to offer their perspective first. And next up, we've got Sonia Orlu, a PhD student at Simon Fraser University. Sonia, I don't want to kind of force you to respond to Dave, but he did make a point that kind of goes into what I want to ask you about, which is this move of CRT from academia to different spheres of society. I'm curious, given that you're a PhD student, how you interact with CRT in the world of academia, and just your sense of, is it a helpful theory? Do you think it explains the world well? Does it help you in your conversations, your analysis of different political phenomena?
Thank you, Jamil. And just to respond to Dave there for a little bit, I'm neither conservative nor evangelical Christian nor white. So I think that there is constructive criticism against CRT that isn't racist or in any way, shape, or form driven by conservatism. So in terms of the academia, there is some sort of, I think I want to tackle your question, Jamil, by laying out two examples for how CRT has been sort of reproduced in academia and within spaces in universities in general. So first of all, CRT, or critical race theory, is a Marxian inspired framework of legal and social analysis. So it starts with the assumption that racial equality is not a realistic goal, and that, and this is using the words of Derek Bell, that a commitment to racial equality merely perpetuates Black disempowerment. So an attempt to address this issue is to view the world from an explicitly racial lens and deconstruct institutions, systems, personal relationships via that lens. And this is where I think we meet a problem with CRT. Is that first, it offers up a univariate analysis of law and society. And by univariate, I mean that it only produces one explanation for what is wrong with society, and that is race. Now, we cannot call a theory rigorous if it's only offering up a singular explanation for the world, or for why the world is the way it is. It is a challenge to mainstream perspectives, quite all right, and that in itself, in academia at least, produces value. We do not want to be stuck in our different echo chambers, our different schools of thought. We need critique. We need a multiplicity of viewpoints, and I think critical race theory, being in a larger critical school of thought, is helpful in that instance. But again, we cannot rely on a univariate analysis to explain the world. And secondly, it lacks external validity. So we cannot generalize critical, or the arguments or assumptions or conclusions of critical race theory to the broader society. Yes, race has impacted people's lives. Yes, race has impacted law and public policy, but that's not the only explanation for why Black people are less likely to graduate from high school, or why Black people find themselves more representative in the criminal population or the prison population. There are other explanations, and especially the fact that it pigeonholes society into this oppressed and oppressor class, when we know that life is a lot more complex than just having two categories of people. And then thirdly, it is unfalsifiable. So a theory cannot be considered rigorous if it's unfalsifiable. Can we prove the assumptions and conclusions of critical race theory to be true or to be fact? If you have assertions like racial equality is not a realistic goal, how do we disprove that? Is it open to being disproved? And that's why you're less likely to see its advocates, so Kimberly Crenshaw, or even the more popular Ibram Kendi, actually defend their propositions in an audience that could challenge them, because they view their perspectives as sacrosanct, as unchanging, as the truth. It reminds me of a UBC report that made mention of the word truthing as a replacement for fact finding. And truthing as a concept is all about centering identity, stating truths that are considered difficult, especially by dominant groups of people. So truthing centers marginalized populations, excluded populations, and gives them a voice in society. Now, there is certainly nothing wrong with giving the marginalized a voice, but when you say that is the only avenue via which we can know truth, or via which we can understand reality, then that is a problem. Now, we see the way CRT has been exposed or has been implemented in the university circle, or in academia in general in Canada. First, we have a wave of equity and diversity portfolios in upper administration. So we've had SFU, we've had University of Calgary, we have University of Guelph. These universities have all created portfolios addressing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And when you read through these portfolios, it's really not as again, objective, or it doesn't necessarily take into considerations objective realities. It's very much leaning into subjective experiences, lived experiences. And I wonder how exactly we're going to gauge the success of all of these portfolios, of these actions that are being taken. Is it just merely to appease a certain population or to show that they are doing something to advance racial equity, or is this actually going to transform society for the better? We have, for example, the SFU, where there was a recommendation passed by the board to cluster hire Black faculty, I believe 15 Black faculty. Now, whatever the criticism of meritocracy is, I don't believe that such affirmative action, blatant affirmative action policy is pertinent, nor is it advisable in the society that we live. First of all, I would hate to be hired just because I'm Black. How does that sort of portray me in the eyes of my colleagues, for instance? Do I come across as someone who's actually very confident in my area of expertise, or am I occupying a space because of the color of my skin? Now, that's something that they would have to grapple with. We've also had in Macmaster University as well, again, cluster hiring or specific hiring of people of specific identity groups in the name of equity. Again, we're yet to see the actual beneficial, objectively beneficial results out of these policies. And secondly, I wanted to talk about viewpoint diversity and the way that CRT minimizes or outrightly dismisses viewpoint diversity. Again, because we are focusing, or because CRT focuses on a univariate analysis of law and society, it by definition will not accept viewpoint diversity, which is integral to university or to academia. We've had situations where a professor I believe economics in Mount Royal University was fired because she was quote unquote racist, whatever that means. She was a known critique. She has been known to critique the Black Lives Matter movement, and apparently it caused harm, whatever that means, to the BIPOC community within Mount Royal University. And after a successful series of campaigns, she was fired. Now, another professor in UBC had his class suspended and was under investigation because he made comments about race and IQ in his class. Now, he did not provide any judgment on race and IQ or any conclusion about race and IQ. He merely just offered up or just commented on the existence of research on race and IQ. And so that has really cemented the fact that viewpoint diversity is slowly being a foregone conclusion in Canadian universities. And if we are to have a broad discussion about progress, about equality or so-called equity, then we cannot rely on these singular univariate theories to do the work for us. It's good as an academic theory, but not as a basis for policy making at all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And I want to come back to your point about viewpoint diversity, because I think that's really key. So we'll save that for later, but we've got two more panelists to weigh in on the sort of open question here about critical race theory. And I want to come to you next, Chris. So Chris Lockhart, who is a very experienced community organizer, very passionate about many of the issues that animate people to debate critical race theory in the first place. He's also a parent, and he wrote a fantastic essay for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on his perspective as a parent with a child in the school system that does have some version of critical race theory kind of flowing through its hallways. So, Chris, I think a good place to start with you would just be getting your sense of, what can critical race theory help us solve? What are the problems that it can be beneficial in addressing? And do you think CRT has limitations?
Thank you very much for that, Jamil. And yeah, I am a father and a community organizer. And my intro to CRT recently came through the conversation that my son in grade 1 had with his grade 1 teacher after the George Floyd tragedy. And because of the virtual learning during COVID, I could kind of eavesdrop on classroom conversations that the teacher was having with my son at that time. And they were talking about the George Floyd death with my son, who was in grade 1. Recently, we had Orange T-shirt Day at the school and across Canada. And my second son, who is now also in grade 1, came home and had a conversation with me about the residential school system. And so at a very young age, kids are being introduced to concepts of race. In my case, it was before I had a chance to sit them down and have a conversation with race. With them. So it's happening at a very early age. And so we have to be mindful of the perspectives that they are learning race through. And critical race theory has raised to prominence. I believe, as Sonia so well articulated, that critical race theory doesn't explain all disparity. So you can have racial disparity, but critical race theory isn't going to explain why racial disparity exists completely. And so, although I believe that critical race theory has a place in the broader discussion, it can't be the only conversation that is had. And so, with that, I really feel like critical race theory, although it's a good conversational piece. And I think with the death of George Floyd and the prominence of racial discussion, we did need an academic framework in order to have these conversations. And I think historically, we're in a time where we're going to be identifying race or racism outside of the context that maybe sometimes racism is occurring. And that's partly because previous to the George Floyd tragedy, public discussions on race weren't happening enough. I know that for myself, when I went through elementary school and high school, there was little to no conversations about race. And so I think that it's good that we're in a place where we are having an open conversation on race. I think some things have added to the difficulty of having an open and free-flowing discussion on race. One is the mainstream media, which wants to make everything seem so contentious. So they want to take somebody from the perspective where just racism isn't occurring at all almost. And then they want to have somebody that's from the perspective where race is occurring everywhere. And then these two individuals are supposed to be kind of like the flag bearers for two opposite sides of a discussion. And when you have the conversation so polarized from those who are leading the conversation, it can only be expected that when people are having the discussions with their family members or with their community members, that the discussion is also polarized. And we need to stop having such a polarized discussion on things that we disagree with. Does racism occur in society? Yes, racism occurs in society. Does CRT helpfully describe some of the disparities in some instances within society? Yes, it does. If you want to look at some places in the education system or some places, especially within the judicial system, I believe critical race theory needs to be a part of the conversation. Does the conversation like marriage and social institutions and community institutions need to be involved in that discussion? Absolutely. Things that are problematic are when institutions, like Sonia also described very well, are taking critical race theory and saying, this is going to be a policy that I make based on solely critical race theory. I thought it was very problematic that when Justin Trudeau was pushed on why people don't want to take vaccines, that the explanation was that people were racist. Justin Trudeau doesn't need to be hijacking anti-racism sentiment or our terminology. And I think any discussion on critical race theory or anti-racism needs to be happening within the Black community and not within institutions or not within kind of the ivory tower that exists that seem to have hijacked the anti-racism discussion. I don't think one of the shortcomings of Black Lives Matter is I don't believe it was as grassroots as it seemed. So it didn't come as much from the local Black community, the local Black church, as previous movements had. And I think that any real progress in the Black community in meeting the disparities within the Black community has to come from the Black community.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I really do appreciate the perspective of parents in a conversation like this, because CRT is becoming such a big part of public education. And I think it's important for parents to weigh in wherever they kind of find themselves on the debate. So thank you very much for that perspective, Chris. Next up is Rupa. And Rupa, of course, again, I encourage you to check out her podcast over at True North. And you can find her writing in multiple places, including the National Post. Rupa, Chris mentioned the mainstream media a few times, I think, when he was sort of explaining how our conversation about race is shaped. And I think it would be fair to say that media corporations have embraced wholeheartedly critical race theory as a way of not only presenting the news, but also as a way of conditioning employees. And certainly I've experienced that in my public battles with Bell Media, for example. So I'm curious, Rupa, your perspective on it. Are things better when it comes to news coverage? Are we getting more accurate, more effective news media as critical race theory becomes more influential? What's your take? Oh, you're muted, Rupa.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. No, I don't, Jamil, I don't think things are getting better. I think, in fact, they're getting worse. The adoption of CRT by some media houses, not everybody, by the way. I don't believe National Post buys into this stuff. It is very disturbing and has no doubt affected media objectivity and credibility in a big way. It does not allow for multiple viewpoints and views everything solely through the lens of race. Critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, neutral principles of constitutional law, Enlightenment rationalism, for example. And critical race theory, I'll get to the media in a bit, but critical race theory believes that racism is systemic, which some of my fellow panelists have talked about, that it's embedded in these thought processes and social structures. It's not just an aberration or limited to the actions of a few people who are racist. White privilege is a key aspect to these social structures where white people are seen as benefiting from a system of, they haven't earned this, basically. And basically, to combat this kind of systemic racism, you need a cultural revolution. So what does systemic racism look like? Well, let's look at apartheid South Africa, where a system of laws and rules essentially limited where Black people could live and the occupations they could engage in, whom they could marry, and denied them the right to elect their own government. Racism was essentially baked into their constitution and laws. That was a systemically racist system rigged to favor white people. Or let's look at segregation America, where Blacks were forced to ride at the back of the bus, and Jim Crow laws essentially disenfranchised them. Now let's look at Canada of today. Is this what we see? Do we have anything like this in Canada? I'd say no. Look at our parliament, populated by people of all races, religions, and backgrounds. Look at our provincial legislatures. Look at the media. Look at all of the talking heads on TV, our opinion makers. We have a diverse group of people. We have Hindus, we have Muslims, we have Black Canadians, we have Asian Canadians, new immigrants, you name it. So when it comes to things like systemic racism, which the media seems to be very, very focused on, are we comparing Canada to some kind of utopian world in which there is no racism and there is no discrimination of any kind? Frankly speaking, such a place does not exist on planet Earth and never has. And I believe that's really an unfair test. The question we must ask, and I think this is a very important question, is whether we have the institutions in Canada, the rules to prevent, if possible, or if not punish racism and other forms of discrimination when they happen. And I think the answer to that is yes. We have robust laws that prohibit discrimination. We have affirmative action codes. We have human rights commissions. We have essentially, as critical as I am of the legacy media, I think more or less the media here in Canada will expose incidents of racism and the perpetrators are brought to justice. So I'd say, if you apply a reasonable standard and not an unrealistic or utopian standard, systemic racism, I believe, does not exist in Canada. And I think my perspective is that Canadians are constantly trying to become more tolerant, trying to be more welcoming to everybody. And I think this is a society that's moving in the right direction. And I worry when I read stuff from prominent proponents of critical race theory like Ibrahim Kendi in his book, ironically titled, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He asserts that the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. This kind of thinking, if you adopt that, especially in the mainstream media, it is very worrying and not the direction in which we want to go. And I do think that the more this kind of thinking becomes popular, I think CRT as a movement will essentially end in failure. Now, back to the media, we've seen manifestations of CRT in the Canadian media space. A recent example of this was when reporters at the CBC apparently asked the broadcaster to drop a requirement for its reporters to be objective. And the CBC is reportedly seriously considering dropping this requirement. That is, if you belong to a visible minority group. The current standards require reporters and staff to remain neutral on political issues. Well, what a huge change that will be, because they're so objective and neutral now. Anyway, all of this is done in the interest of ending structural racism or systemic racism, and would largely apply in the CBC's case in cases of activism relating to BLM and other issues. So that non-white reporters do not feel like they need to leave their humanity at the door. I don't even know what that means. Another example, if you recall, at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Canadian Media Guild wrote a letter to the CBC urging the broadcaster to dismantle structural racism and diminish the power of white editors. This is quite extraordinary, the language of this. And I do think that a better path forward for the CBC and other legacy media is to consider adding objectivity and impartiality as a requirement for its journalists, irrespective of their background, color, race, ethnic origin, etc. I'm going to end my remarks on that, but I'm very happy to amplify these points in the Q&A, Jamil.
Thank you very much, Rupa. So a lot of really good stuff for us to dig into from your comments, and we've already got a bunch of questions in from the audience. So what I'm going to ask our panelists to do is try to give me, as best as possible, concise and crisp answers, because I'd like to get to as many topics as we can. And I'd also like to make sure everyone has at least one more chance to weigh in the conversation. So where I'd like to begin here is I want us to go back to Samuel. And Samuel, I'd like for you to address something that Dave said, which is very much reflected in some of the comments and questions we received so far, which is this idea that critical race theory is drawing attention to historical inequalities and historical injustices. What's wrong with that? And do you think that critical race theory, or opponents, I should say, to critical race theory, are denying that these historical injustices and inequalities occurred and need to be attended to? You're muted, so everybody just know that you're muted before you start talking.
Yeah, that's actually one of the biggest myths about critical race theory, that it's a historical, it's dealing with history, when it's really not. When you read Derek Bell, when you read Kimberly Crenshaw and a lot of their peers, they make it very clear. They're saying that America today, or Canada today, is just as racist today as it was, in the past. This is because, as Derek Bell especially says, that critical race theory is a counter to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was dealing with the historical and present issues of systemic racism in America. Well, critical race theory say that no, America's very foundations, not its history or Canada's, not just Canada's history, but as a Western nation, it is built on values, not necessarily even laws or policies, but values such as the Global Affairs Canada says, meritocracy, freedom, individualism. There's a reason why the Trudeau and a lot of the people who were against the Freedom Convoy labeled it white supremacy, because they very much believe that our Western values are inherently oppressive, including things like the free market or capitalism. Right. So we need to to remember that, again, reading all the historical, all the books on critical race. For example, there is one of the founders of critical race theory is a man named Charles W. Mills, and he wrote a book called From Class to Race. And in the book, he's basically saying that critical race theory is a racial version of Marxism. Therefore, it is, again, not necessarily dealing with the history of the West. It is dealing with the very foundations, our cultural values, our political values, including, again, individualism, liberalism, right? Because I'm forgetting who mentioned it, but it's been mentioned already that they question the very foundations of the liberal order. So this is not about dealing with the history of America by any means, because frankly, when you read critical race theory today, they're not talking about Jim Crow. They're not talking about slavery. They're really addressing the present day issues that they believe are racist, particularly dealing with equity. I've heard it said, I want to be concise, but I've heard it said that there are some inherent benefits of critical race theory. And I want to read something just to really explain that I think that's inaccurate. Critical race theory really is irredeemable. So I will read. This is from the Government of Ontario's website, okay, and it's defining racial equity, which is really the hallmark of critical race theory as a Marxist framework. It says this: racial equity is a systemic fair treatment of all people. It results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. It contrasts with formal equality, where people are treated the same without regard for racial differences, which, as Rupa mentioned, it really is following Ibram Kendi's framework, where he says if racial discrimination is defined as treating, considering, or making a distinction in favor or against an individual based on that person's race, then it is not inherently racist. The defining question is whether the defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If it's creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist. That is really the heartbeat of critical race theory. It's saying it is okay to show partiality or to discriminate against people, especially white people, if it creates equity. That is the hallmark of racism, and that is the hallmark of critical race theory.
Thank you, Samuel. So as I said, I'm going to try to give everyone a chance to weigh in, and I'll ask you a question that I think fits with something we're hearing from the audience. Dave, I want to go to you next and give you a chance to respond to Sonia's argument, because I think sort of toward the end of your statement, you sort of suggested that opposition to CRT is a conservative position or right-wing position. I can tell you very much so that there are many people who do not identify as right-wing or conservative who do oppose CRT, and I think Sonia illustrated that quite well. Can you maybe share your point of view on that? What would you say to someone who says, well, I don't disagree with you, Dave, on a whole bunch of things, but when it comes to this form of race politics, that's where we might have disagreement?
Yeah. So, wow. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. In terms of where I see the loudest voices coming out, on average, on social media against CRT, it is coming from groups and individuals that, in the majority, are associated with the far right, with evangelical Christianity, and a lot of shit that I'm really opposed to and really scared of and frightful for. And I feel that those are forces trying to take us back on a whole range of issues, including LGBT and abortion rights. So of course, I'm not saying that every person who is against CRT is involved with that, but there is a definite correlation there, and I'm not going to back down from that because it's very clear to see all across the states, and including some of the folks on this panel. It's not a singular approach. Yeah.
Dave, can I just ask you a follow-up, because you're continuing to lean into the generalization.
Yeah.
And I'm wanting you to sort of speak to the fact that maybe your generalization is inaccurate to begin with. I'll just give you another example. So Francois Legault just got reelected by a supermajority in Quebec. He would agree with you on all of these social issues, as would most Quebecers if you look at who they vote for. And yet he has publicly disagreed with the concept of systemic racism. So I'm wondering if you could explain a bit more why you're associating opposition to CRT with these other issues, because I could point to a litany of examples where that's just not true.
Yeah, again, I would say that you're cherry picking. So if you Googled, anything that's against anti-CRT, like did a Google search and tried to find the most watched videos or the loudest voices against it, it would most likely be people who have also been rallying against a lot of other progressive reforms for the last 10, 20 years. We could try it right now live as an experiment. So if you find a few other examples, that's great for you. I'll also point out that the Conservatives actually, the Legault in Quebec only got a majority because of first past the post. The majority of Quebec didn't vote for him. But this is all a distraction. I'm not sure I understand how this is relevant to the question of whether CRT is a helpful lens to use to understand the world and to improve ourselves. You had asked me why I accepted the invitation. I gave you one of my reasons, which is that when I see viral videos against CRT, it is coming from platforms that also espouse values that I find kind of gross, kind of outdated, kind of hurtful, kind of hateful. And so that's just what I'm seeing on the internet. Obviously, I'm not equating the two. But in terms of the reasons I use personally to defend it, I stand by those. I don't think something Sonia mentioned was interesting, which is that CRT proposes like a singular approach. I've never heard that from any of my colleagues or anyone else I know who supports using CRT as a lens. No one I've heard has ever said this is the only lens we should look through, and race is the only thing that matters. I've also never heard the idea that racial equity is not a realistic goal come out of the mouth of anyone I know. So what the panel is doing here is finding like these obscure sentences spoken by cherry-picked people to try and suggest that this entire idea of critical race theory, which really shouldn't be that controversial at all, is somehow this terrible thing. And it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it's a unfortunate kind of how you're going about arguing your point, Dave, because you're not talking to the people who are talking to you. You're kind of talking past everyone. So you're telling a bunch of people who don't agree with things you're accusing them of that they believe in something they don't believe in. And then when they point out they don't believe in that thing, you're saying, well, that's cherry picking. But these are human beings who are trying to have a conversation. I'd like to go to you next, Sonia, because I think Dave is continuing to associate your point of view with things that you're explicitly saying you don't agree with. And I think you should be able to respond to that.
Yeah, so everything I've said, every conclusion, assumption of critical race theory that I mentioned is in fact said by the leaders of the critical race theory school of thought. The assertion that racial equality is in fact not a realistic goal is a direct quote from Derek Bell. So you can look that up. I would not cherry pick anything to support my point of view because I value objectivity in my arguments. So, but generally speaking, I don't think that you can definitely make the argument that there are bad faith actors that are jumping on the bandwagon for against TRT. But if we had Alex Jones, conspiracy theorists, also saying that gravity is real, that wouldn't necessarily make gravity not real. So we need to understand that there can be truths and there can be facts, and people that we don't like or people that are against our position, generally speaking, can still being in favor of ideas that we personally support. So I think in as far as I'm concerned, in my personal experience, in my own circle, the people who are against critical race theory, or maybe not so much against, but critique critical race theory, are people from a diverse background, people who are classical liberals, people who ostensibly support the same things that you support, Dave, but we just do not see value in characterizing society as one that is primarily defined by racism. And so, by extension, in order to address those deficiencies, we then have to again keep prioritizing race. I don't think that that is a helpful solution at all to social problems. And people who I know, at least, and people who are in my circle, people who are liberals, also share that point of view. So it's not just a conservative agenda to be anti-progressive by dismissing CRT. There's an actual foundational empirical analytical critique, educated analytical critique, to be levied against critical race theory.
All right, Rupa, you were unmuted. I don't know if you want to weigh in on that, but I also wanted to ask a question that was submitted by one of our audience members, which is sort of the relationship between present day and history. How do we think about how history informs present day issues? How do we separate the two? If you want to weigh in on that, I think you'd have an interesting perspective, given the international journalism you've done has probably encountered this in other countries as well. You're muted, Rupa.
Mute, but
There we go.
okay, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, could you repeat that question, Jamil? Sorry.
Well,
yeah.
I wanted to. So we have a question from the audience, which is, how do we separate the present day issues from history? Is there no such thing as a legacy of history? And I think ultimately, this is a problem every country has to encounter, which is, what is the relationship between our past, our present, and our future? How do we
Right.
separate current politics from past politics?
Well, no, you can't separate who we are today from our past. Our past is very much part of our identity. History is extremely important. Look, no sensible person, no reasonable person is making the argument that that we shouldn't acknowledge past historical wrongs against, let's say, First Nations, Black people, that racism doesn't exist. Nobody is making these claims. No one is saying that these things didn't happen. But this is a point I repeatedly make. The Canada of today is not the Canada of 1867 when things were different. And I think as a society, we have made a lot of important changes over the decades to get to a point where someone like me, a person of color, an immigrant who's been here for 25 years, I have an opportunity to do the kinds of things that I enjoy doing. And so, I look at Canada of today while I acknowledge its history, and I'm cognizant of that history, and I'm aware of it, and I'm constantly trying to improve myself. And I think that's the best we can all do. I think this road that we're on, that we're constantly self-flagellating and ourselves over past historical wrongs, I don't think it's a very helpful way of moving forward. I think what CRT in fact has done in Canada is that it has reinforced group stereotypes. It shames meaningful dialogue, and it, I think, worsens race relations. It has the opposite effect of achieving harmony in society, of achieving racial harmony, and I think it leads us to worse outcomes, not better. In my opinion, CRT is its own form of soft bigotry. It might be a bit harsh to say that, but the way it's being practiced and advocated these days, I think it's its own form of soft bigotry. And also, let me point out something. CRT is essentially a non-issue in places like India that I'm familiar with. This is an issue that seems to be very prevalent in Canada, maybe even more so than the US. I think Samuel was making that point earlier in his remarks. The rest of the world, Europe, for example, you think they're obsessed with CRT? You think they're having these discussions? I don't think so. These are countries that are typically on the left. They're socialists, and they're not having these discussions. So what is going on here in Canada? Why are we so obsessed at looking at everything through the lens of race and identity? It just doesn't make any sense to me. And this came as a surprise to me when I returned to Canada in 2019. I'd been away for about a decade. When I returned, I was just astounded at the kinds of issues that we were focusing on, and the kinds of arguments and debates we were having that was just strictly focused through the lens of race and ethnic identity, and not acknowledging all of the progress that we've made as a society.
So I want to bring the conversation back to Bill 16 in Ontario, formerly known as Bill 67, because I think it will show the practical implication of the conversation we're having right now. And I'd like to get Noah and Chris to weigh in on this. Bill 16, if it were passed, it's been brought back to the legislature by the NDP in Ontario. Would essentially equate anti-racism, which is the act of being a non-racist, with embracing concepts like systemic racism and white privilege. When we talk about the soft bigotry, as Rupa has mentioned, what that would mean in effect is that if you are a Black man, like let's say Thomas Sowell, and you wrote a book about how to help your community, but you did not embrace concepts like systemic racism and white privilege, your work as a Black man would be considered insufficiently anti-racist. It would not be included in the curriculum or in the school system as part of a diversity and inclusion agenda. And in fact, a teacher promoting your perspective could be fined for not operating within the confines of the supposedly anti-racism spectrum. So there are real consequences for a school system embracing this stuff. And I think Noah and Chris, I'd just like to hear what you think of the conversation happening around schools, Bill 16 in Ontario, and broadly speaking, what CRT means for the education system. Noah, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's really concerning that not only is critical race theory being promoted excessively in our education system, one of the reasons why or one of the motivating factors behind critical race theorists and them developing their agendas so that they can, first and foremost, push this into the education system. And what's really concerning to me is the fact that not only its implementation, but the sort of censorship and the idea that you have to shut up if you disagree, because if you disagree, you're a racist who needs to be ostracized from society and needs to be penalized. I don't think it is. Not only is it just not productive to take this approach, it is and it's anti-Canadian. But this is to be expected. As Rupa said, if you just crack open any introduction to critical race theory or any book talking about critical race theory, you would know that some of the animating desire behind critical race theories to tear down the liberal order. It's a radical ideology. I would say it's reactionary in the sense that it prioritizes racial essentialism. A key a hallmark of reactionary thinking. We typically think of it as being white supremacist and alt-right sort of reactionary thinking. But I think critical race theory slots into that category pretty well. But just sort of the idea that you need to shut up. This has been a process that has been happening for a while. Justin Trudeau's passage of Bill C-16, I believe, in his first session of Parliament. It is basically a law that basically furthered the sort of idea that if you have something that is maybe considered to be offensive, maybe goes against what the society at large, generally believes, that you need to be silenced. And I don't believe that Ontarians in general buy into critical race theory, but nonetheless, our education system will be geared and directed in a way that doesn't allow for those outside perspectives, those perspectives that people may really believe deep down, but because they don't hear those outside perspectives, because they only are enmeshed in this sort of critical race theory lens, they're not able to sort of really identify with something that they really believe with. When I was going through the educational system, I wouldn't say critical race theory was nearly as prominent as it is now, and it is going to be in the future. But there was a real suppression of I wouldn't say there was suppression, but there wasn't really like exposure to the idea that the disparities between whites and blacks, and some of the problems that the black community may affect may not entirely be caused by white people, that there may be some things that black people can do to help themselves. And once I did research outside of the school system, I was able to find that perspective, which really resonated with me, and I was able to do deep research and create a nuanced perspective. But the school system, the way the NDP want to gear the school system towards, and hopefully not the Ontario PCs, is that that this perspective that I buy into, that many of the panelists buy into, it needs to be suppressed. It can't be allowed in the school system.
So, Chris, I think what I'd like to highlight, which I think may have been lost a little bit, Dave seems to think he's the only person who has anything positive to say about CRT on the panel. And I just think it's worth noting that you actually had a lot of positive things to say about it in your comments earlier as well. So I think you offer a nuanced view on maybe the place of CRT in the school system. What's your take on that? And especially with this very practical example of a bill before the Ontario legislature that would essentially mandate critical race theory in some capacity in Ontario public schools.
Thank you for that. Yeah, even if a theory is completely incorrect, I think that there is some value in it. Samuel and Sonia did a very good job of articulating the origins of CRT within a Marxist framework of thought. And we still study Marxist frameworks in school. We still study Marxism, even though a lot of us reject some of the applications of Marxism in a practical, real-world sense, it still has some merit as a theoretical framework. And so even though I reject some of the applications of CRT and a lot of the applications of CRT, I still do believe that it has a position within the broader conversation on racial issues. I think that people of color want to talk about race, and we're happy that we're having a public conversation on race. And if even the only value of CRT is to dismantle its conception of race, then inherent within CRT is something of value. And so I think that everybody on the panel gave an amazingly insightful perspective. And I think that it's not about taking CRT off the table. It's about including CRT in a broader conversation. And it's just like the bill attempting to fine individuals that aren't talking within an anti-racism framework. We can't use these things to punish individuals that aren't on our side. We need to have a diverse discussion on CRT and issues regarding race. And that doesn't mean fining people that don't agree with us. And it doesn't mean taking theoretical frameworks or theories outside of the discussion. Any theory that you have in order to describe racial disparities deserves a spot at the table. Does CRT deserve the most prominent spot? Maybe it doesn't deserve the most prominent spot, but I think we should still accept it at the table. Does a teacher that doesn't teach anti-racism deserve to be fined? No, they don't deserve to be fined. And bills like that are very problematic. But Jamil, you did an awesome job of arranging a conversation where we could have this exchange. And I think CRT is one component of a broader conversation on race.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I think how we could use the remaining time is, Dave, I'm going to give everyone just a final word. So we'll come back to you, but I'm just going to go in the same order we started in, just for the sake of keeping track of everybody. So maybe final 30-second closing statement from each person on the panel. Samuel, we'll start with you. You're muted. Everyone, remember to unmute yourself before you start talking.
Yeah, I don't know, I have 30 seconds, so I'll just quickly say this. Critical race theory, I believe, is harmful for all people, harmful for white people, and especially black people. It is not helping anybody. After years, not really from 2020, but well before that with the Black Lives Matter riots, originally in Ferguson, it has not helped black people whatsoever. It's actually made things worse. Crime rates are worse. Every level is harming black people. And it's also, of course, harming white people as well, too. So, very quickly, I've said this many times before, growing up, I was told that as a black person, I won't amount to anything because of the fact that I was black, that Canada was against me. So what did that do? I said, they would oftentimes say that you shouldn't, that as a black person, you'd have to work twice as hard as a white person to have the exact same outcome as a white person. So then that made me say, then why should I work twice as hard only not to be ahead? So it actually promoted discouragement in me, and it did not help me whatsoever. I don't want any child being told that they are oppressed, especially black people being told they're oppressed, because it's not going to help them or white people as well, too.
Thank you, Samuel. Noah, 30-second closing statement.
Yeah, I don't believe that critical race theory is an accurate conception of the world. I believe that it is an overly simplistic way of viewing things, and it doesn't account for the nuance and the complexity that we as humans just are inherently embody. I believe that the excessive prioritization of race when viewing the world and how to interact with individuals is what led to sort of or it is what animated sort of the white supremacist and backwards thinking of the past. And I believe that embracing a society that embraces critical race theory will inevitably produce a counterculture that is far more destructive than the sort of alt-right counterculture that has been geared toward or geared against critical race theory online currently. So I just in general believe that Black people, white people should be treating each other based on the quality of their character and not the color of their skin.
Thank you, Noah. Dave, 30-second closing statement.
Thanks so much, Jamil. I agree with Chris in a sense that I think something like CRT has value, but of course it's just one tool in a very large toolbox, and it's not all about race, and it's not all about CRT. I see the anti-CRT movement as doing a lot of fear mongering and cherry picking, and Bill 16 is a great example. Bill 16 doesn't even mention critical race theory. It just says that every board should establish a racial equity plan and provide resources and strategies. It's just common sense stuff. And my last thing I want to say is I'm hearing a big inconsistency from people who are saying that we need to have viewpoint diversity, yet a whole bunch of you seem to be saying we need to take this whole theory and make sure it's not being taught anywhere and not being taught in schools, which to me sure sounds a hell of a lot like cancel culture.
Thanks, Dave. All right, next up is Sonia.
Okay, I'm going to reinforce again that opposition or challenge to CRT is not solely conservative, that there is a liberal critique of CRT that exists. So we need to recognize that race is arbitrary and socially constructed, and it will go a long way in helping us achieve a cohesive society. And we can't do that when race is reinforced as a predominant explanation for society, the way society is. It's also imperative that we advocate for an accurate rendition of history, as well as for the rights, freedoms, and opportunities, access to opportunities for people that are without. But we must also understand and acknowledge that the defeatist, race essentialist, and reductionist rendition of reality that CRT offers cannot be the basis for sweeping changes to law, public policy, and educational curricula. So yes, CRT is valuable in so far as it is a viewpoint, but it cannot be the sole viewpoint.
Thank you, Sonia. Next up, Chris, 30-second closing statement.
I think that while we critique CRT, I think we need to be able to celebrate conversations surrounding race issues. I think we still need to deal with conversations around slavery, around inequity. I think as we critique CRT, we still have to know that even without CRT as a framework, we still need to talk about race. And whether you're on the left or you're on the right, you're conservative, you're skeptical of racial issues, or you believe racism is happening everywhere, I think conversations around race are important. Not everything's academic. People have their own experiences, and it's a very emotional topic. And I think a lot of that gets lost in more academic or more media involved conversations, is that you're actually dealing with people's identities and people's emotions. And I think having an empathetic and sympathetic vantage point in having conversations with people, I think even people that you disagree with, you'll be able to push the conversation along a lot further.
Thank you, Chris. And last closing statement goes to Rupa.
Oh, sorry, I'm muted.
No, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, you can. Okay, you can hear me finally. Well, I think critical race theory is, viewing everything through the lens of race. I think it's a slippery slope, and it's deeply problematic, a slippery slope that will eventually allow governments to favor one group over another. And taken to its logical conclusion, I really think critical race theory is incompatible with a society and liberal democracy and the way we understand the world. And, racism is complex. Inequity is complex. It's more than just policy prescriptions, simplistic solutions that CRT claims to offer. And unfortunately, what's ended up happening with CRT is that I believe it has made things worse. As I mentioned to you earlier, it reinforces all of these group stereotypes and worsens race relations and societal harmony, and actually we're worse off than we were, and this is why I oppose CRT.
Well, thank you to each of our panelists for their insightful comments, and thank you to you, the viewer, for tuning in. My concluding statement is going to be very short, which is just, I ask you to just take what you've heard in today's conversation and ask, what are the problems that we can actually solve by applying critical race theory? What are the problems that have already been solved by applying critical race theory? To me, that's the value of any theory, any worldview, any idea, is what does it actually do for people? And I would challenge anyone who thinks that they have a strong opinion on critical race theory one way or the other to test their point of view, test their assumptions on that basis. Who is benefiting? What is changing? What powerful people are being challenged to do something differently? And what disadvantaged or marginalized people are seeing material benefits from these ideas? I think that's really what this comes down to. And I hope this conversation helped you think about these things, helped you reflect on these things, maybe gave you a new perspective on an issue you heard about but haven't had the chance to think about yourself. We really appreciate you tuning in on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the Speak for Ourselves project, and of course, your panelists. We hope you have a great day. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, everybody.